Saints Row 2 is a game that I can say so many single positive sentences about. It was an amazing game. It was a game like no other. It was a combination of all the right stuff during development to make for a totally awesome experience. All of those and anything else I say about it like that would be true for me, because I thought Saints Row 2 was an amazing game. And despite its jankiness and overall age, 15 years after its release, it is still an amazing game. Saints Row 2 was developed by Volition and released on this day 15 years ago, October 14th, 2008. Now, in case you really just don't understand why they stuck the number 2 after the words Saints and Row, I might as well explain to you that it was the sequel to the 2006 Xbox 360 exclusive called Saints Row, not the reboot. Saints Row 2 was a little bit more available than that. Besides the 360 release, it was also on the PS3, and in 2009, it was ported to PC by CD Projekt Black, which is rather unfortunate because the PC version was also notoriously broken, and it still is. But on console, it plays just fine, and if you're on Xbox, it's backwards compatible. Now, this game came out the same year as Grand Theft Auto 4, and if you aren't familiar with this by now, then you know that pretty much anything major developed by Rockstar is going to be some tough competition if there's other games coming out around the same time as something by them. Especially if it's a game that draws a ton of comparisons to the one that they're releasing. Kinda like Saints Row 2. They're not totally alike, but you play as a criminal in both. There's an open world city to explore. You can run around stealing cars or blowing stuff up. But hey, a lot of similar products are sold on the market. It doesn't make them rip-offs of each other. Who's to say that two games that are similar in nature can't coexist peacefully? Saints Row 2's producer Greg Donovan certainly thought so. The first screenshots of this game were shown off at a conference that he was at in London in March of 2008, and he was quoted as saying this in an interview that was given around the same time. "We wouldn't be releasing this year if we didn't think it would be competitive." He then listed off a few things that distinguished the game from GTA 4. While GTA 4 was headed in a more realistic direction, for Volition, Saints Row 2 was about mixing hyper-realistic looks with over-the-top moments and compelling gameplay, and being able to play the entire game from start to finish with a co-op partner if you wanted to. And they did double down on the comparisons with GTA 4 with a trailer that they made. It made fun of some elements of GTA 4. It basically came down to this. When you're playing a video game, would you rather do menial activities that you can normally do every day? Or would you rather blow stuff up and do things that you normally would never be able to do? Now, having been a fan of both GTA and Saints Row, and also being old enough to remember this, I remember the reaction to this trailer, and a lot of GTA fans were very butthurt over this, for lack of a better term. But Saints Row 2 gave players a choice, and player choice is where this game really shines. From the get-go, outside of the story, there's a wide variety of things to do across Stillwater. You can drive a taxi and get paid to shuttle people around the city, you can be a tow truck driver and get paid for doing that, but the game also doesn't forget that you're playing as a complete sociopath, and that we as the players have the most amount of say in what the player character does. So besides having one of the more normal jobs that I mentioned above, there's drug running side missions, hitman side missions, you can be a bodyguard for celebrities that throws insane stalkers in various Final Destination style death traps. Oh, and you can drive a septic truck around town and spew raw sewage out of the top to lower property values in the area. Now that last one might sound ridiculous, but I am pretty sure it was based on something that happened in real life. How about I tell you a little story before we continue? In 1995, in the countryside near Newcastle, England, a farmer out there got really pissed off with his local bank over a mismanagement of his accounts, and the dude lost a lot of money because of them. So he did what any level-headed citizen with a grudge and access to farming equipment would do, and drove his tractor into the city to spray down the entire bank building with manure. And guess what? This wasn't even the last time he even did this. After he got out of jail and sued the bank, he did the same thing to a local council office because they refused to let him have land to build a house. Now, this case was on TV a few times here in the US back in the 90s and 2000s, and I wouldn't be surprised if Volition got the idea for the Septic Avenger from a developer there, seeing the incident on some show like Maximum Exposure. Now, in the game, there's way more stuff to do than just that and the other activities I mentioned, but that's the other fun thing about it. The game has a crazy amount of variety. You could also dress up like an average Joe, or dress up in some goofy-ass outfit if you really wanted to, but the game doesn't force you to do that, and I think that's for the best. That's something that I think the Saints Row team got wrong starting with the third game. They knew people loved being able to do the silly stuff, but then it's like they were trying too hard to be silly and it just came off as weird. Doing stupid stuff became mandatory instead of it just being there if you wanted to be a goofball. Now, the story of Saints Row 2 follows a very similar path that the first game did. You've got multiple different criminal organizations across the city, and your goal is to eliminate all of your competition and basically become the kingpin. It's a classic underdog to top dog tale, but something about the writing and the characters in this game just helped make it feel a lot more memorable and fun to play through. Good acting throughout too. Everyone that was in it did a pretty good job with their lines, and there were some really good action moments as well. It kind of feels like a Quentin Tarantino movie at times. And lo and behold, Quentin Tarantino movies were actually a really big influence on the story according to the developers. Each gang that you have to fight against is unique in their own way, and you can also choose what order you want to go after them in. No matter what, it always leads to the same story outcome, the wider gentrification plot. In the background for most of the story, a major multinational corporation called Ultor has been pulling strings in the background, and they were also working both with and against criminals whenever it financially suits them, because their ultimate goal is to foster gang violence in poor neighborhoods, which then causes property values to decrease. Then once the neighborhoods are total war zones and the police become overwhelmed, Ultor steps in with their resources and helps clean up the area, while also helping themselves to buying up loads of properties and essentially making the neighborhood their own little utopia, where they've rebuilt things, made tons of improvements, they own all of the land, and they also get to make loads of money in the process. Meanwhile, all of the poorer residents are basically shoved aside to make way for yuppies and rich people. They show this having already happened to the Saints Row district. If you ever played the first game, you would know that that district is basically the hood, and by Saints Row 2, it's pretty much an extension of downtown. Now, this was actually a really clever story angle, and while it's presented in a more over-the-top nature, it was actually way better writing and a more interesting story than what the same writers did with the games that followed it. I know the developers mentioned that Quentin Tarantino was an influence on the game, but the Ultor part of the story kind of reminds me of OCP from RoboCop. I swear, between this game and Red Faction, it's like Volition were the Paul Verhoeven of video games. But there's another thing that differs this game from GTA, something that I think Volition did an incredibly good job on, and that would have to be the open world city that they designed. Stillwater is an amazing open world map. It's the same city from the first game, but since then it's received a makeover. I should mention that Stillwater was already well designed in the first game. Back then, Volition set out to make sure that every neighborhood felt unique and distinct from one another, while also ensuring that it was still a realistically laid out city. The city itself is supposed to be in the Midwest, most likely somewhere in the Great Lakes. Volition themselves were located in the state of Illinois, in Champaign, which is about a 3-hour drive from Chicago. Though I never really felt that Stillwater resembled Chicago at all. It doesn't look anything like it aside from the subway trains. If anything, it reminds me of a smaller or mid-sized city. It feels like a city for several 100,000 rather than several million. Honestly, it reminds me more of Minneapolis, and it's got elements of Detroit as well, and a little bit of Milwaukee. And somehow it feels super cozy, despite the fact that it's supposed to be wrought with gang violence. Mr. Saints Godzilla and I did a whole video together where we talk about this amazing fictional city, mostly how it progressed into what we got in Saints Row 1. For Saints Row 2, the first game's map had to be used as a base that they would then build upon. I think they knew that in order to sell a game when it's set in the exact same city as the first one, they would need to make some changes to it. First off, almost every single neighborhood in the game was updated in some way, from small stuff like new signs and textures on buildings and billboards, or slight changes to road layouts to make it more easy to navigate, to huge changes like entirely new districts being added, and a couple of old ones being completely reworked from the ground up. The suburbs were expanded with new subdivisions built. They added a marina district with a boardwalk and a hotel strip. There's a huge university with a little campus town area and the campus itself. By the way, the campus resembles the main campus for the University of Illinois, which is no surprise because U of I's main campus is located in Champaign, where Volition were also located. The titular Saints Row district was the most obvious change. It went through gentrification turned up to 11. A few buildings in the old district looked like they were still around and rehabbed, but everything else changed. It went from being the hood to basically being an extension of downtown. The airport also changed a lot. In Saints Row 1, they planned on the airport being this huge international airport, but there also weren't even any flyable planes in the game, and I think they realized that it would be kind of a waste to have an airport that big. So it got trimmed down to just being a little airstrip that resembles the real-life Willard Airport in Champaign, which Wardell Airport was named after. By the time they made Saints Row 2, they made it into a major airport again, including reusing a lot of assets that were originally made for the first game. And the main terminal building is completely accessible, by the way. That's another thing about this game that makes it fun to play. Within the city, you have all these different interiors, all sorts of buildings to go into and explore or have fun with. It helps the city feel like an actual city and not just a backdrop. You aren't completely confined to just being outside. Half of these places were used in missions, but the other half were there for players to just find. Their sole purpose was to aid in exploration. And nothing stayed locked forever after seeing it once in a mission. You could still go back and explore these places if you wanted to. And there's always lots of NPC activity around them, so it doesn't feel like you're just going into an empty building with nothing in it. So we touched upon multiple things that make this game really good. A story that isn't stupid, a map that's varied and fun to explore, player choice in what you want to do. But there's another thing that I think makes this game really come together, and that would be the soundtrack. Like GTA, a majority of songs you hear are going to be on the radio stations that you can listen to when you're in a vehicle. You've got K-Rhyme for hip-hop, Gen X for late 2000s rock. The Mix is an all-80s format back from a time when 80s nostalgia was huge. There were even radio stations like that in real life, too. And then you had Underground 99, which played a lot of indie rock and post-punk. They were supposed to be a pirate radio station, and they serve as another great example of the surprising amount of detail that this game has, and the effort that went into it. Because they mention on this radio station that they are a pirate station, broadcasting from Stillwater University, their signal comes in clear in and around the university, but the further out you go, the worse the signal gets. And eventually you can go so far away that the radio station isn't even an option in the car anymore. The broadcast originates from this tower, and I know that you used to be able to blow this thing up and the whole radio station would just go off the air completely. For some reason, it won't happen anymore on the Series X, but I know when I used to play this on the 360, that's what happened. I'm not sure if it's just a new glitch on the modern consoles, or if it was somehow a glitch to begin with and I just misinterpreted it as another detail. But either way, them having a radius of where you can listen to this station was a cool detail on its own. One of many cool details. It's stuff like this that makes this game such a cool one to go back to after all these years. The little details, the story, the music, the environments, not to mention the gameplay is still a lot of fun too. I couldn't even tell you how many hours I sunk into this game over the years, but I think it was an amazing game for its time. If you've never played Saints Row 2 before, do yourself a favor and play it already. I think it's the closest that the industry has gotten to a true competitor to Grand Theft Auto, and I really wish that things hadn't panned out the way that they did for the franchise after this came out, because to me it almost feels like they just lost their stride. It's like they couldn't figure out what to do with the franchise, all because of THQ's financial issues and a desire to not be known as a GTA clone. It went from a crime game to a comedy crime game to a sci-fi game to a Disney Channel original game, or at least something of that nature. Personally, I think they nailed it with Saints Row 2, and I think they should have stuck with that formula, but that's just me. Saints Row the Third wasn't a bad game, but even when it came out, I thought it felt like it was just lacking a lot of what the second game had. One thing I remember actually thinking was weird that they didn't include anymore was being able to just pick random stuff up off the ground and use it as a weapon. There are so many things laying around Stillwater in Saints Row 2 that you can just pick up, run off with, throw at traffic, or beat somebody up with. But in Saints Row 3, they only had that in one mission. It's so weird because the mechanic is there, but they decided to not have anything around the open world for you to actually do this with. The tone was so much different in Saints Row 3 as well. And then the extremely unfortunate reboot happened, which was Volition's second flop in a row after Agents of Mayhem. And as you likely know by now, Volition shut down back in August of this year. This was after they got shifted over to Gearbox from Deep Silver, and they lost the rights to Saints Row in the process, meaning that even if they hadn't been shut down by Embracer Group after that failed deal with Saudi Arabia, they would not have been working on anything related to Saints Row. I know it's probably a moot point by now, but with the games Volition used to make, compared to what they've done in the last 10 years, it feels like they just had a ton of potential as a development studio. Saints Row could have been a major GTA competitor. And then their other main franchise, Red Faction, could have been another beast on its own given that the selling point was a dynamic destruction engine that Volition developed themselves. And it looked really awesome. Let me tell you, there's nothing more satisfying than driving a car into a building and crashing straight through it, or also being able to knock down these giant smokestacks, and knowing that it's going to collapse differently every time. But you can tell that starting around the early 2010s, there must have been some serious budget issues and just poor decisions being made, which was conveniently also around the time that THQ, their former publisher, really began to run into financial issues. And after that, it's like Volition just became inconsistent in the quality of their releases. The reboot of Saints Row that we got, being something that probably nobody outside of corporate focus groups asked for, likely did not help things. It kind of felt like there were multiple different people pulling in different directions over what they wanted Saints Row to be. I guess I just wish that we could have gotten another game out of them, like Saints Row 2. Saints Row 2 2, if you will. A story that doesn't take itself too seriously, but that's also like something out of a Tarantino movie, with a bit of Paul Verhoeven and Michael Bay sprinkled in, as well as a well-designed, unique, and realistic-looking open world, and a ton of things for the player to do. Remember what I said earlier, player choice is a key thing with this game. Also a key thing is remembering that the central cast is made up of violent gang members. Definitely not the first to appear in media either. The fact that we play as such a callous and uncaring individual in the game is so jarring when you compare it to the relatable and lovable protagonist that they were going for with the reboot. Now, I'm not saying that violence should be glorified, but given that the central characters of so many TV shows and movies are similarly horrible people, I do think that there's room out there for another video game that doesn't pull so many punches and just tries to play things safe. Now, if you've played Saints Row 2, what did you think of it? And if you've never played it, what the hell are you waiting for? If you have an Xbox, it's cheap on the Microsoft Store. Buy that and the first game right now. Trust me, if you've never played them and you're a fan of GTA, both games will be really nice experiences to tie you over until GTA 6 eventually comes out. Now, if you have any good memories of playing this game, let me know. Thank you for watching.